Under the fading sun of an old western afternoon, the air over the desert town shimmered like a mirage. Horses stood restless outside the saloon, their reins swaying gently in the dry wind. The scent of dust, sweat, and gun oil filled the streets, where silence often meant danger and words carried the weight of survival. It was in this moment of stillness that she first saw him, an Apache warrior, tall and unreadable, standing in the middle of the main street as if he owned the very ground beneath his feet. His dark hair brushed his shoulders, tied with a leather cord, and his eyes held the kind of quiet defiance that could make armed men hesitate. No one dared speak his name aloud. Some said he'd once been a ghost on the frontier, others whispered he'd survived battles no man could. But to her, was simply the one man who made her. Heartbeats sound louder than the world around her. She had no business crossing paths with him. Her life had been quiet until the ranchers' feud began, until the town that once welcomed her turned cold, suspicious, and cruel. Her late husband's debts had left her cornered, her small home nearly taken, and her reputation hanging by a thread. The preacher's wife no longer spoke to her, and the men who once tipped their hats now crossed the street when she passed. Yet on that evening, when the Apache walked into the mercantile where she stood, trembling beside the counter, fate took a sharp turn. The door creaked as he entered, shadows spilling in behind him. His presence drew every eye, yet his gaze found hers instantly. It wasn't the kind of look that asked permission. It was the kind that demanded silence. A group of ridersmen from the sheriff's posse had followed him in, their boots echoing on the wooden floor. "He's the one of them spat. Half-breed or not, he's got no right being here." They were armed and looking for trouble, but the Apache didn't flinch. He simply turned to her, voice low enough that only she could hear. "Pretend you're my wife in front of them." The word struck her harder than any blow. For a heartbeat, she forgot to breathe. His hand rested lightly on her arm, not forceful, not cruel, but firm enough to make the lie believable. Her heart thundered as the riders sneered, circling like vultures. The air thickened with tension. She could almost hear the metallic whisper of fingers brushing gun handles. "Your wife?" The leader laughed. "That's rich. Since when does an Apache take a white wife?" The room froze. Her lips parted, but no words came. She felt every stare burn against her skin, yet something in the warrior's eyes held her steady. He didn't plead. He didn't explain. He simply looked at her as if he trusted her to save them both. And somehow she did. She lifted her chin, meeting the gaze of the men who once mocked her, and said, "Yes, he's my husband." The silence that followed felt endless. Then the posse leader spat on the floor, muttered something foul, and turned away. "You're a lucky woman," he said. "You'll regret that lie." As the door slammed shut behind them, the weight of what she'd just done settled over her shoulders like a shroud. The Apache released her arms slowly. "You shouldn't have spoken," she whispered. "Now they'll think it's true." He studied her face, unreadable, then said, "It needed to be true. For now." Outside, the sun had dipped below the ridge, staining the sky the color of dried blood. The town was watching. She could feel it through the glass. Her heart ached with confusion, fear, anger, and something else she couldn't name. That night, she lay awake listening to the wind push against the shutters. Every creak of the old house felt like footsteps, every shadow like a warning. She thought of the way he'd said those words, not as a trick or a command, but as a shield. He had protected her, though she didn't understand why. The rumors would spread by morning. A widow hiding an Apache in her home was reason enough for the townsfolk to burn her out. Still, when she heard the faint knock at her door near midnight, she didn't hesitate. She opened it, and there he stood, blood dried on his shoulder, eyes sharp yet softened by exhaustion. "I won't stay," he said quietly. "Just until dawn." She should have refused. She should have told him to leave before the sheriff came looking. Instead, she nodded and stepped aside. He entered silently, the firelight catching the old scars along his arms. She could smell the desert dust on him, the faint scent of smoke. He sat near the hearth, saying nothing, as if he belonged nowhere and everywhere at once. She poured water into a basin and handed it to him, her hands trembling slightly. When he spoke again, his tone carried the weight of an old wound. They hunted my people. I was the last to leave the mountains. Now they call me outlaw. She met his eyes and saw not the savage the townsfolk whispered about, but a man carrying the burden of survival. "Why did you choose me?" she asked softly. He didn't answer right away. The silence stretched between them like a thin line ready to snap. Then he said, "Because you looked at me without fear." The night deepened, the moon casting long silver lines across the floorboards. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote cried, and the town slept under its own guilt. She found herself staring at him, wondering how a man so feared could sit so still, so calm. His hand brushed the edge of the table, where her late husband's old revolver rested. "They'll come for you because of me," he said. "You can still send me away." But she didn't. She simply turned toward the window, where the stars burned faintly through the dust. "If I send you away," she said quietly, "they'll still come." When dawn came, the town buzzed with rumor. The preacher's wife passed by her gate, whispering to a neighbor. The blacksmith wouldn't meet her eyes. The lie had become truth in the mouths of others, twisted and poisonous. She felt the sting of isolation settled deep in her bones. Yet inside her heart, something had shifted, a strange calm, a forbidden courage that frightened her more than any threat. Later that morning, the Apache was gone. No note, no word, just a faint trail of footprints leading toward the hills. She stood on the porch, her shawl pulled tight, staring at the empty horizon. But as the wind carried the scent of sage and dust, she heard faint hoofbeats approaching from the north. She turned and saw riders, 6 of them men from the posse. Their silhouettes cut through the sunlight like blades. Fear surged through her chest. They had come again. The lead rider dismounted, his eyes sharp with suspicion. "We heard your husband ran off," he said. "Maybe he left something behind we should find." She swallowed hard, her pulse quickening. They pushed past her, searching every corner, every room. One of them found the basin by the hearth, the water still faintly red. Another lifted the revolver. "You helped him," the leader said, his voice dripping with accusation. "You lied for him?" She felt her knees weaken. But before she could answer, a shadow fell across the doorway. The Apache stood there, silent as the grave, his rifle leveled steady. Dust swirled around his boots as his gaze locked on the men. The air grew heavy, thick with the promise of violence. "She's my wife," he said, his voice like thunder over the plains. The men froze, hands twitching toward their guns. And in that frozen moment between life and death, between truth and lies, her heart shattered not from fear, but from the realization that he meant it this time. The story of what happened next would be whispered through that desert town for generations, but that moment, when the Apache's voice broke the silence and his words broke her heart, was the moment everything changed. The Apache's words hung in the air like a verdict. The men didn't move, and neither did she. For a heartbeat, all sound vanished, except the wind moaning through the broken fences outside. Then the leader stepped forward, his hand resting near his revolver. "You think we'll believe that?" He sneered. The Apache didn't reply. He only shifted slightly, enough to let the sunlight catch the metal of his rifle. The look in his eyes said more than any threat could. The men hesitated, and she saw it, the flicker of fear that turned brave men uncertain. The leader spat on the porch, muttered something, and motioned for the others to back off. "This ain't over," he said, before turning his horse and riding away. The sound of hooves faded into the distance, leaving behind a silence that weighed on her chest. When the last rider disappeared, she finally breathed again. The Apache lowered his rifle, but his shoulders stayed tense. He looked at her, the faintest hint of apology in his eyes. "They would have hurt you," he said quietly. "Now they'll think twice." She wanted to ask what kind of man he was, why he'd risk his life for her when he owed her nothing. But the words wouldn't come. All she could feel was the tremor in her hands and the ache in her throat. "They'll come again," she whispered. "They always do." He nodded, gaze fixed on the horizon. "Then we'll be ready." That night the sky was restless with wind. The small cabin creaked under its breath, and the old lantern by the window flickered weakly. He sat near the fire, his face half hidden in shadow. She poured him coffee, her movements slow, deliberate, as if she were afraid the world might collapse if she spoke too loud. "You should tell me your name," she said finally. He stared into the flames before answering. "Names bring trouble," he said, "and I've brought enough."
She almost smiled at the way he said it, steady, with no trace of arrogance.
"Then I'll call you nothing," she replied softly. "And you can call me the woman foolish enough to lie for a stranger." He looked up then, really looked at her. And for a moment she saw something human in those sharp eyes, something tired and wounded. "You didn't lie," he said. "You survived." The fire crackled between them, and she realized how strange it was that she no longer felt afraid. The danger wasn't gone. It had simply taken a new shape, one that stood before her with quiet strength and a rifle across its knees. As the night deepened, he began to speak. Slowly, in pieces, like someone testing if trust could still exist. He told her of his tribe, of the raids that drove them into the desert, the families lost in the canyons where the army had hunted them down. His voice carried no hatred, only memory. "They called it victory," he said, "but for us, it was the end of the world." She listened in silence, the pain in his words sinking deep into her chest. She thought of her own loss, the husband buried behind the church, the dreams she'd once had of building something lasting in this land. Both of them were ghosts of what used to be. When he finished, she found herself whispering, "You don't look like a killer." He didn't smile, didn't even blink. "That's because killing changes what you look like inside, not outside." The wind outside howled, rattling the loose boards, and she pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders. There was so much she wanted to ask him: why he came to town, why he'd chosen her, but something in his stillness warned her not to. Some wounds weren't ready to be touched. By morning, the storm had passed, leaving the land washed in pale gold light. Smoke rose from the chimneys across town, and she could already see two men lingering near the well, pretending not to watch her house. The gossip had spread fast. She could almost hear their whispers drifting on the wind. The widow took an Apache in. They say he sleeps under her roof. Maybe she's lost her mind. Shame and anger twisted inside her, but when she turned back to the man still sitting at her table, she didn't regret a thing. He had cleaned his rifle, repaired a torn strap on his saddle, and eaten half the bread she'd baked the day before. "I should leave," he said simply. "If I stay, they'll burn this place." She stepped closer. "If you go, they'll hunt you down. They want blood, not justice." He paused, his jaw tightening. "Then they'll have to find mine in the hills." She wanted to stop him, to tell him he didn't have to keep running, but her throat tightened with words that wouldn't come. She reached for the empty cup he'd left on the table and noticed his hand scarred. Strong, with a mark that looked like it had been burned into his skin long ago. "What is that?" she asked softly. He pulled his sleeve down, ignoring the question. "A reminder," he said, "of what happens when you trust the wrong people." He left before noon, disappearing into the desert like a shadow swallowed by light. She stood on her porch long after he was gone, watching the horizon as if it might bring him back. The day dragged on, heavy and uncertain. By afternoon, the sheriff came riding up with 2 deputies. His face was hard, his eyes sharp beneath the brim of his hat. "We heard you were harboring a fugitive," he said. "That true?" She met his gaze, her voice steady. "No one's here but me." The sheriff dismounted, glanced through her window, then back at her. "Folks are nervous," he said. "They think that Apache might come back. You'd do well to tell us if he does." She nodded, but deep down, she knew she wouldn't. That evening, as the sun fell low over the plains, she walked to the river. The air smelled of dust and sage. She knelt by the bank, her reflection rippling in the water, and wondered when her life had begun to unravel. Maybe it wasn't the moment her husband died. Or when the debts came due, it was now, with one whispered lie that had changed everything. She'd always believed she knew who she was, but now the certainty was gone. On her way back, she found something wedged between the boards of her porch, a small token, made of leather and turquoise, the kind she'd seen worn by Apache women. It was his. She turned it over in her hand, feeling the warmth still trapped in it, and realized he hadn't gone as far as he'd said. Somewhere out there, He was watching, waiting, maybe protecting her from the shadows. The thought brought both comfort and fear. Days passed, and the tension in town grew. Cattle went missing, fences were cut, and every small misfortune was blamed on the Apache. She became a target of suspicion. The preacher stopped coming by, and one night, someone threw a rock through her window with a note tied to it. "Send him back where he belongs." Her hands trembled as she read it, and for the first time, she felt truly alone. But the next morning, when she stepped outside, she found fresh tracks near her gate hoof prints, leading toward the ridge. He had been there again, silent as always, watching. That night she lit a candle and left it on the windowsill, a small signal glowing in the dark. She didn't know if he'd see it or if he'd understand, but she needed him to know she hadn't forgotten. The night stretched long, the sound of coyotes rising over the plains, and just before dawn, she heard a soft tap at the door. Her breath caught as she opened it. He stood there, windblown and weary, eyes dark with something she couldn't name. "They're planning to take you," he said. "Tomorrow." "The sheriff? The men from the saloon? They think you know where I am." Her heart pounded. "Then why come here? You'll make it worse." He stepped inside, closing the door behind him. "Because you don't deserve to suffer for me." She could see the desperation in his face now, the weight of guilt pressing against his calm. "You think I can undo this?" she asked. "It's too late. They've already decided who I am." He looked at her for a long moment, then said softly, "Then let them think what they want. But I won't let them hurt you." Outside, the first light of morning brushed the horizon. The wind carried the faint echo of horses in the distance, moving closer. She felt the ground tremble beneath her feet, fear clawing at her chest. He moved to the window, checking the ridge. "They're coming," he said quietly. She took a step toward him, voice shaking. "What will you do?" He didn't answer right away. The silence between them felt like the calm before a storm. Then he turned, his gaze steady and full of something she'd never seen before. Resolve, maybe, or sorrow. "You asked me once why I chose you," he said. "Now you'll see." Before she could reply, the sound of horses filled the yard. Dust rose, voices shouted, and the sheriff's men surrounded the house. The Apache reached for his rifle, but his eyes never left hers. "Stay behind me," he said. "Whatever happens, don't speak." Her pulse raced as she stood frozen by the table, the candle still flickering beside her. Through the window, she could see the sheriff dismounting, his gun already drawn, and as the first knock thundered against the door, she realized something she hadn't before. This wasn't just his fight anymore. It was hers too. The lie that once protected them had become the truth neither of them could escape. The pounding at the door grew louder, shaking the old frame as dust fell from the rafters. She could hear the men outside shouting her name, ordering her to open up. The Apache didn't move. He stood by the window watching their shadows stretch across the yard in the rising light. "They've brought more this time," he said quietly. She could hear the tremor of restraint in his voice. Her heart raced as she looked around the room, searching for anything that could change what was coming. But there was nothing, only the worn table, the cold ashes in the hearth, and the silence between them that carried too many unspoken fears. "Open up, woman." The sheriff barked. "We know he's in there." His voice cracked through the morning air like a whip. She stepped toward the door, her hands shaking, but the Apache caught her wrist. His grip was firm, his eyes steady. "If you open it, they'll drag you out with me," he said. "Stay where you are," she wanted to argue, to tell him there had to be another way, but the look in his eyes stopped her. He moved toward the door, rifle ready, but lowered. "Go out the back," he whispered. "If they break through, run for the river." She shook her head fiercely. "I won't leave you." He stared at her for a long second. Something heavy passed between them, something neither dared name. The door burst open before she could speak again. The sheriff and 3 men stormed in, guns drawn. The light behind them caught on their badges and polished belt buckles. The Apache didn't raise his weapon. He stood there, calm but unyielding, while she froze beside the table. "Step away from her," the sheriff ordered, his revolver aimed square at the Apache's chest. You've caused enough trouble. The warrior's voice was low, steady. She has done nothing. The sheriff laughed. Nothing? You made her lie. You made her harbor a criminal. That's enough to hang you both. The men moved closer, boots scraping against the wooden floor. She could smell the sweat, the gun oil, the whiskey on their breath. Her pulse roared in her ears. One of them, a younger man with a scar along his cheek, looked uncertain. "Sheriff," he muttered. "He ain't armed." The sheriff shot him a hard glance. "He's Apache. That's armed enough." The words stung her like a slap. She stepped forward without thinking. "He saved my life." She shouted, "If not for him, those same men you protect would have burned my home to the ground." The room went still. The sheriff's eyes narrowed. "You keep talking like that, and folks will start thinking you've forgotten who you are." The Apache's gaze met hers briefly, calm even as the tension thickened. He spoke again, his voice quiet but carrying a sharp edge. "I'm not your enemy," he said to the sheriff. "But if you harm her, I will be." The sheriff smirked. "That a threat?" "No," the Apache replied. "It's a promise." The moment hung in the air like a spark before a storm. The sheriff cocked his gun. "Then I guess we settle this now." Before he could fire, a shout came from outside. "Sheriff." Smoke by the corral. The men turned, distracted. The Apache moved fast, pushing her toward the back door. "Now," he whispered. She hesitated, torn between fear and disbelief. "Go," he repeated, his tone final. She ran out into the yard, skirts catching on the dry brush, the morning sun glaring against her eyes. Behind her, she heard gunfire, a single sharp shot, then another. She stopped in the field, her breath burning, listening. The echoes faded, leaving only the sound of the wind. She turned and saw the Apache on horseback, riding hard toward the ridge. The sheriff's men chased after him, their shouts fading as they vanished beyond the hill. The town would say he ran because he was guilty, but she knew better. He ran to protect her. Still, the guilt gnawed at her as she stood there alone, her house broken, her name ruined. By evening, the sun dipped behind the mountains, staining the land in deep gold. The sheriff came back, dust covering his coat, his face dark with frustration. "He's gone," he told her coldly. "But we'll find him, and when we do, you better pray you're not with him." She didn't answer. He waited, perhaps hoping to see her break down, to hear her beg for forgiveness. But she stayed silent. Finally, he turned and left, his men trailing behind him. She closed the door after they were gone and locked it, though she knew it wouldn't keep out what haunted her now. Days turned into weeks. The town watched her like hawks, whispering behind her back whenever she went to the well or the trading post. The preacher refused her entry to Sunday service, saying the Lord would not welcome sin under his roof. She wanted to scream, to tell them what they refused to see, that goodness didn't always wear a white hat, and evil didn't always come painted in feathers and dust. But she said nothing. The silence became her armor, and her guilt, her only companion. Then one night, as a storm rolled in from the west, she saw a shadow at the edge of her field. Her heart leaped. She stepped outside into the rain, her shawl clinging to her shoulders. "Is it you?" she called softly. Lightning flashed, and for a moment she saw him tired, soaked, but alive. He moved toward her slowly, his figure outlined against the dark horizon. "They won't stop," he said. "They've brought soldiers now." She felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. "Then you can't stay here," she whispered. "If they find you, they'll hang you." He nodded but didn't move. "There's a place north of the canyon," he said. "Old mission ruins. I'll go there when the storm passes." She wanted to tell him not to go, that the world beyond those hills would swallow him whole. But the words caught in her throat. Instead, she said, "You'll die out there alone." His eyes softened. "I've been alone my whole life," storm thundered overhead. She stepped closer, the wind tugging at her hair. "You don't have to be," she said. For a second, something passed between them, something fragile, fleeting, and dangerous. But before it could become more, he turned away. "If I stay," he said, "they'll kill us both." When he left, She stood in the rain long after he disappeared into the dark. The storm washed the dust from the land, but not from her heart. She returned to the house and lit a single candle, watching its flame fight against the wind. Every creak of the floor, every howl outside made her wonder if he was still out there, fighting his way through the night. In the following days, soldiers arrived in town blue coats. Stern faces, orders from faraway generals. They questioned everyone, searched barns, tore through fields. The sheriff worked beside them, hungry for praise. They said the Apache had attacked a convoy and taken weapons, but she knew it wasn't true. He had been running, not fighting. Yet the story grew with every telling. Some said he was gathering his people in the hills. Others claimed he was coming back for revenge. And each lie drew the noose tighter around her neck. She found herself caught between two worlds, hated by one, hunted by the other. Each night she dreamed of the canyon, of the firelight flickering against stone walls, of a voice whispering her name. One evening, unable to bear the silence any longer, she packed what little she had and left. The town lights faded behind her, swallowed by the vast, dark plains. She rode until her hands blistered, following the trail north. When she reached the canyon, dawn was breaking. The ruins stood silent, carved into the rock like bones of the past. And there he was, tending a small fire, his rifle across his knees. He looked up as she approached, but didn't speak. She dismounted, her legs trembling. "You shouldn't have come," he said finally. "They're watching the roads." "I had to," she said. "They'll kill you, and I can't just wait for the news." He stared at her, torn between anger and disbelief. "You don't understand what you've done," he said. "They'll call you traitor." She stepped closer. "Then let them." "I've been called worse." Turned away, jaw tight. "You think this is a story that ends with mercy? There is no peace for people like me." She looked at him, her voice breaking. "And what about me?" He said nothing. The silence between them was heavier than the air before a storm. From the ridge above, the faint echo of hoofbeats drifted down. She looked toward the horizon and saw dust rising in the distance. Soldiers. The Apache stood, his hand tightening on the rifle. "It's too late," he said. "They've found us." She felt her heart sink as she realized there was no escape left. The world that had turned against them was closing in, and all they had left was the truth that had grown between them. Fragile and doomed, as the sound of the riders drew nearer, she turned to him and whispered, "What will you do now?" He looked toward the canyon mouth, the light of the fire reflecting in his eyes. "What I must," he said, "and what they'll never forgive." The wind carried the smell of smoke and rain as the first shot rang out across the valley, marking the beginning of a battle neither of them had chosen, but both were bound to fight. The sound of gunfire cracked through the canyon air, sharp and hollow, bouncing off the stone walls until it seemed to come from every direction at once. She ducked behind a fallen beam, heart pounding in her chest. The Apache had taken position behind a pile of rocks, steady and silent, eyes scanning the ridgeline. The soldiers were closing in fast, their shouts echoing through the narrow pass. Smoke from their rifles drifted upward, mixing with the dust and turning the dawn light into a haze of red and gold. Her breath came quick, shallow. As she watched him move, each motion controlled, deliberate, almost calm despite the chaos that surrounded them. He fired once, then twice, hitting the dirt near a soldier's boot to drive him back. He wasn't aiming to kill, not yet. She could see it in his restraint. But the soldiers had no such hesitation. Bullets tore through the dry brush, splintered rock, and wind past her head. She pressed her palms over her ears, fighting the urge to scream. "They'll trap us," she whispered. He didn't look back. "They already have." His voice was steady, like the wind that never stopped blowing through those desolate plains. He pointed toward a narrow path leading deeper into the canyon. "That way," he said. "There's a riverbed beyond the bend. Follow it north." It shook her head. "I won't leave you again." His jaw tightened, frustration flashing in his eyes. "If you stay, they'll take you alive." "You don't know what that means?" She did know. She'd seen what happened to women accused of helping Apaches, how townsfolk turned justice into cruelty, how mercy disappeared when fear took its place. "Then we go together," she said, voice trembling. He looked at her for a long moment, and something inside him broke. He lowered his rifle slightly, as if surrendering to something larger than war. The gunfire slowed, then stopped. Silence spread through the canyon, heavy and uncertain. The soldiers were regrouping. The pause was worse than the noise. It was the sound of men reloading, planning, surrounding. He motioned for her to stay low and crawled up to the edge of the ridge. She watched him, every movement sharp and precise. The morning sun caught on his skin, and for a brief second, she saw him not as a hunted man but as something untamed and proud, like the land itself. Then she heard a sound that froze her blood, the creak of wagon wheels. She turned and saw them coming through the canyon mouth, a covered cart with chains hanging from the sides, followed by soldiers on horseback. Her throat went dry. "They brought shackles," she said. "They're not here to kill you, they want to make a show of it." He didn't reply. He just loaded another round into his rifle, his expression unreadable. "Then they'll learn what it means to cage a wolf," he said quietly. The soldiers fanned out, taking positions along the ridges. One of them raised a flag, a white square, waving slightly in the breeze. "They want to talk," she said. "Don't shoot." He hesitated, lowering his rifle slowly. The flag bearer called out, "Lay down your weapon. The woman will be spared." The words echoed through the canyon like poison. She turned toward him, shaking her head. "They're lying." He looked back at her, the faintest trace of a bitter smile on his lips. "I know." The officer stepped forward, hat in hand, his voice carrying over the distance. "You can't win this. There's 20 rifles aimed at you right now. Give yourself up, and we'll make it quick. The woman doesn't have to die for your sins." The Apache said nothing. His gaze swept over the soldiers, the wagons, the dust rising under their boots. Then his eyes met hers, and she saw it the moment he made his choice. He whispered something she barely caught, a word in his tongue that sounded like a farewell. Before she could ask what it meant, he turned and moved toward the far side of the ridge. She followed, desperate. "What are you doing?" she cried. "There's nowhere left to run." He stopped and looked back at her, his voice low. "I'm not running. I'm leading them away." The realization hit her like a blow. "No, you can't. They'll kill you." He glanced toward the canyon wall, where a faint trail led upward. "Maybe," he said, "but if I don't, they'll kill you too." Before she could argue, a gunshot rang out. The bullet struck the ground near her feet, throwing dirt into the air. The soldiers had seen them. The Apache grabbed her hand, pulling her behind the rocks as gunfire erupted again. Stone shards flew, the air thick with powder and smoke. He fired back, quick and precise, forcing the soldiers to duck. "They're coming from both sides," he said through clenched teeth. "If they close the pass, we're finished." She glanced toward the narrow trail winding upward. "Then we climb," she said. He nodded once, and together they ran for the rocks. The climb was brutal. The stones cut into her hands, the air burned her lungs, and every step felt like it might be the last. Bullets pinged against the rocks below, but somehow they kept moving. When they finally reached a ledge overlooking the canyon, she collapsed against the stone, gasping for breath. The Apache crouched beside her, scanning the ground below. From their height, she could see the soldiers spreading out, forming a line. The cart stood in the middle like a trophy waiting to be filled. He took a deep breath, eyes narrowing. "They won't stop until I'm dead," he said. "They want to make sure no one remembers me as anything but a criminal." She looked at him, her voice barely a whisper. "Then let them remember you as the man who stood his ground." He turned to her, surprise flickering in his eyes, then nodded slowly. "If that's how it ends, so be it." They stayed there, listening to the echo of boots on stone, the soft clink of metal as the soldiers prepared for the final push. The wind carried the scent of rain and gunpowder. It reminded her of the night he first came to her door and how one lie had bound them together. "You never told me your name," she said quietly. He hesitated, then answered, "It's not a name you can speak, but it means one who walks in fire." She smiled faintly, even through her fear. "Then maybe I was meant to walk beside you." Below them, the soldiers began to move again, cautious but relentless. The officer called out, his voice echoing up the canyon walls. "Last chance. Come down and surrender." The Apache raised his rifle, aimed carefully, and fired. The officer's hat flew from his head as he stumbled back, cursing. The soldiers responded with a hail of bullets. The rocks around them exploded into fragments. She pressed close to the wall, eyes squeezed shut, whispering prayers she hadn't spoken in years. Then the firing stopped again. She opened her eyes and saw that the soldiers were holding their ground, waiting. The officer stepped forward, shouting, "You're surrounded! We have more men coming from the south. You can't win." The Apache looked down, then turned to her. "He's telling the truth," he said quietly. "But it's not about winning anymore." The sky darkened as storm clouds rolled in from the horizon. Thunder rumbled, deep and slow, echoing across the valley. The air felt heavy, charged. The Apache adjusted the strap of his rifle, his movements calm. "When the rain comes," he said, "the sound will hide our steps. If we can reach the upper ridge, there's a path that leads to the river beyond." She looked at him, torn between hope and fear. "And if they find us first," he met her eyes, "then I'll do what I was born to do." Lightning flashed, and for an instant, the world turned white. The wind howled through the canyon, carrying dust and rain. The first drops fell cold against her face. She reached for his hand, gripping it tightly. "You don't have to fight them alone," she said. He looked at her, his expression softening for the first time. "You already fight beside me," he said. "You just don't carry a gun." The storm broke then, rain pounding against the rocks, washing away the blood and dust. The soldiers fired again, their shots muffled by thunder. The Apache stood, rifle raised, defiant against the storm. She saw him silhouetted against the lightning strong, unbroken, like a figure carved from the land itself. The soldiers advanced, shouting orders drowned by the roar of wind and rain. She watched as he turned toward her, rain streaming down his face, and said the words she would never forget. "If I fall, don't look back." Before she could answer, another shot echoed through the canyon. The sound tore through her chest like the wind itself. She couldn't see where it came from, only the flash of gunfire and the faint outline of the Apache standing firm. His rifle still steady, his figure fading in the storm. The battle had truly begun, and with every shot, every heartbeat, she knew the end was drawing closer. The rain fell harder, the sky split with thunder, and in the chaos of that moment, the line between love and survival blurred until she couldn't tell them apart. The rain came down in torrents, washing the blood and dust into the earth. As thunder rolled through the canyon, smoke rose from the rifles, mixing with the mist, and the smell of gunpowder lingered heavy in the air. She could barely see him through the haze, only the faint outline of his body standing against the storm, unyielding. Every crack of lightning showed him like a ghost, defiant against the odds. She shouted his name, but her voice vanished into the wind. Then, in a flash of white light, she saw him stumble just once, and her heart stopped. He dropped to one knee, clutching his side. And for a moment, everything went still. Her breath caught as she ran forward, ignoring the bullets that tore through the rain. The soldiers shouted for her to stop, but she didn't care. The world had narrowed to the small patch of ground where he knelt, the rain streaking down his face, his hand slick with blood. She reached him, sliding to her knees beside him, her hands trembling as she pressed them against the wound. "You're going to be fine," she whispered, though her voice shook with fear. He looked at her with that quiet calm she had come to know, the same calm that had frightened and comforted her the first moment they met. "Don't cry," he said softly. "It's only pain." Soldiers were closing in now, their shadows moving through the fog. She could hear their boots splashing through puddles, the rattle of chains from the wagon below. "You have to move," she said, trying to lift him, but he shook his head. "No, if I move, they'll follow." "You go?" She refused to let go. "I'm not leaving you again," she said, tears cutting through the grime on her cheeks. He reached up weakly, his hand brushing her face. "You already saved me," he whispered. "You gave me something worth dying for." She felt the world tilting beneath her as his words sank in. The thunder cracked again, and the soldiers shouted from below. The Apache turned his head slightly, eyes sharp once more, and said, "When I fire, run to the ridge. Don't stop until you reach the river." She shook her head, refusing, but he gave her a look that silenced her protest, a look that carried both command and love. He raised his rifle with trembling hands and fired one last time, the shot echoing like the cry of something ancient and wild. The soldiers scattered, ducking for cover. And in that moment of confusion, he pushed her away. She stumbled toward the ridge, turning once to see him still there, kneeling in the storm. Holding the rifle steady as the soldiers closed in again, her voice broke as she screamed for him, but the wind swallowed her words. She ran, heart hammering, her skirts heavy with rain, climbing until her lungs burned. Behind her, the sound of gunfire filled the canyon one final time, and then it stopped. The silence that followed was worse than the noise. It felt endless. When she reached the top of the ridge, she turned back, her body shaking from exhaustion and fear. Through the mist, she could barely make out the canyon floor below. The soldiers were gathered around something, their forms blurred by the rain. She wanted to run back, to fight, to do anything but stand there helpless. But her legs refused to move. The storm began to fade, leaving behind only the quiet drip of water and the distant cry of an eagle. She sank to the ground, clutching the leather token he had given her, the turquoise now slick with rain. The land stretched out before her, vast, untamed, and achingly empty. By the time the soldiers left, the sun had returned, washing the canyon in pale light. Smoke rose from the fires they'd set to burn what remained. She watched from the ridge, hidden among the rocks, waiting until the last horse disappeared over the horizon. When she finally made her way down, the ground was blackened, the air heavy with the smell of ash. She found his rifle lying near the riverbed, its metal cool under her fingertips. There was no sign of him, no body, no blood trail, nothing but the silence of the earth. It was as if the storm had taken him back. She stayed there for hours, sitting beside the river that wound its way through the canyon, thinking of the promise in his eyes. He had said he wouldn't let them take her, and he'd kept his word. The water shimmered in the sunlight, carrying bits of leaves and ash downstream. And she felt a strange peace settle over her chest. Maybe he wasn't gonna, not really. Maybe he had become part of the land, like the stories his people told, where the spirits of the brave watched over the living. She whispered his name into the wind. It carried her words far beyond the canyon walls. When she finally left, she walked north, just as he had once told her. The journey was long and harsh. She passed abandoned settlements, broken wagons, and the skeletons of towns left behind by greed and drought. But she kept going, carrying his rifle across her back and his memory in her heart. At night, she built small fires and listened to the sounds of the wilderness, the cry of wolves, the whisper of the river, the rustle of the wind through the sage. It all reminded her of him, the man who had asked her to pretend for a moment and ended up changing her life forever. Months later, she found refuge in a small valley near the mountains, where no one knew her name or her past. She built a cabin near a stream and planted a small garden, living quietly among the hills. Sometimes travelers passed through, anchors, trappers, wanderers, and they told stories of an Apache ghost who roamed the desert, guarding lost souls and driving away outlaws. She never spoke when they mentioned him. She only smiled faintly and poured them coffee, her hands steady, her eyes distant. But at night, when the stars came out and the fire burned low, she would sit on the porch, tracing the turquoise token between her fingers. The wind would shift, carrying a scent of rain and desert dust, and she would swear she could hear him again, the faint echo of his voice whispering her name. The memories came back like pieces of a dream, the heat of his hand on hers, the weight of his words, the way he had looked at her that first day in the mercantile when everything had changed. She thought of how fear had once ruled her life, fear of judgment, fear of loss, fear of loving someone the world told her she shouldn't. But that fear had burned away in the fire of what they shared, It left behind something purer, something that couldn't be buried or forgotten. Love, she realized, didn't always end in comfort. Sometimes it lived in the ache, in the empty places, in the memory of someone who stood between you and the world. Years passed, and the land healed. Grass grew again where the fires had scorched the canyon floor, and wildflowers covered the hills in spring. She aged quietly, her hair silver, but her eyes still holding that same fierce light. One evening, while walking along the river, she found an eagle feather caught in the reeds. She picked it up, turning it slowly in her hands, and felt the same stillness she'd felt that morning after the storm. She tucked it beside the turquoise token on her table, symbols of two worlds that had once met in defiance and ended in grace, as the sun set behind the mountains. She sat by the fire and whispered the words he had once said, words she had never understood until now. "Pretend you're my wife," in front of them. It hadn't been a command. It had been a plea for belonging, a desperate reach for humanity in a world that wanted to strip it away. And though it began as a lie, it became the truest thing she had ever known. When the night grew quiet, she stepped outside, the cool wind brushing against her face. The stars shone brighter than she had ever seen them, scattered like embers across the dark sky. Somewhere in the distance, a wolf howled, and she felt no fear, only peace. The land that had once been soaked in sorrow now hummed with life, and she knew that part of him lived within it still. She smiled, her heart calm at last, and whispered into the wind, "You kept your promise." The breeze stirred, warm and soft, brushing her cheek as if in answer. She closed her eyes, feeling the world settle into silence. The story of the Apache and the woman who defied her world would fade with time, turned into rumor and legend. But the truth, the quiet courage, the love that had bridged to broken souls, would remain, carried forever by the land that had once held them both. And as the fire burned low, the night embraced her in peace, leaving only the whisper of the wind, the river's song, and the eternal calm of the desert under the stars.